University of Leeds are joining us online for this session that we're going to have. The agenda, it has been shared for this meeting. We are starting the meeting now. It's a 2-hour meeting when we are going to receive some outputs from the iFEED process the University of Leeds and Chatham House colleagues have been working on. And I trust you all traveled safely to South Africa. Yes, you were scared, many of you, coming to South Africa, given what COVID is doing, what you've been reading about or watching over the news. But we want to assure you it's not as bad as what you see on the news. We are here, we are continuing life as normal, and I hope you will do the same. But we want to emphasize the need for all of us to take all the necessary precautions. Don't throw caution to the wind. We want you to go back to your countries as healthy as you came to South Africa. So let's make sure that we observe all the COVID protocols so that we protect ourselves. Let's do the sanitation, the no hugging. Yes, I saw a few of us were hugging each other. Yeah, but as much as we can, let's avoid that so that we do what we are being told to do. To start off the meeting, I don't know if there are any housekeeping, Shiluva, but I'm sure you are nicely settled in your hotel. We'll tell you we are providing, you are here on a bed and breakfast basis. Soon after the session, there are 2 things that are going to happen. The finance team will be giving you your per diems, as well as we have the COVID people coming here to do your testing so that the results come out in time for your flights back home. So at 4 p.m., soon as we finish this session, you are going to get your per diems, but also the COVID testing. They are coming on site to the hotel to do your testing from here. So those are the arrangements that we have done. Otherwise, I think everything else you should be comfortable with. To start us off, maybe let me ask Tembi, I'm sure we all know her by now, Director of Policy Research and Analysis at FANAPAN, to give us some welcoming remarks. Tembi.
All right. Oh, gosh. Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. It is very good to see everyone. The last time we saw each other physically was in 2019, I think. It was in Rwanda, for those that remember. Yeah? Yes. It's been very long. But we have to be thankful for technology, right? Because it has kept us all connected, and it feels like we have been seeing each other, even if we haven't physically met. For me, I think it's a bittersweet moment in that we lost a whole year of not physically meeting. You know that for some of us, I don't want to just generalize, but for some of us, African culture, we work better when we see people, when we talk to people, when we sit down with people, when we eat with people. So a year of working virtually has been rather challenging, but I think we have all learned and grown from that. So I am very excited to welcome you all to Pretoria, and very thankful that you actually took the time to leave your homes, even after the announcement that came in the late hours of Friday about this new Omicron variant. We want everybody to be safe. And program-wise, I think this is also a very critical point in terms of the AFRICAP project. In all fairness, this will probably have been our end of project workshop, but because of the no-cost extension, we have another 4 months to go, and we have an opportunity to be able to come together to review the sort of research outputs that are coming out of iFEED, and to be able to sort of map out a way of how we're going to take these messages to policymakers in our different countries. But it's not just in the last 4 months of the project, but we have to think beyond the 4 months. What happens when AFRICAP ends? Does the iFEED work end there? or do we have the capacity to be able to sort of apply it in our different spheres of influence and take it forward? I think that's what's very important. I would like to especially welcome the iFEED champions that are probably joining this group for the first time in person. We are very thankful and appreciative of the work that you have been doing. You have been part of the AFRICAP team, I think, for a little over a year and a half now. And your inputs and contributions have really made a difference in the work that we are doing. So we're really grateful that you are able to join us and that you are listening and hopefully already cooking up ideas of how to take the work forward. So thank you once again. For those that are joining us online, our colleagues, we wish you were here in Pretoria with us, but we still appreciate that you are joining us virtually. So Ian, I think I'll hand over to you and just say thank you once more.
Thank you, Tembi. I see online we have some colleagues from University of Leeds, Andy, Stuart, Helen, plus our Team C leads. I see you are all online. If you can put on your videos, we want to see you. We also have our FunPan CEO, Dr. Chilidzi Madzivandila. He's also online. We can see you tomorrow. Dr. Chilidzi, you'll be joining us. Today, you are going to follow what we are doing here. I also see we do have online our champion for Zambia, Dr. Frank, who couldn't travel, as well as our node coordinator for Zambia, Masie, who couldn't travel as well. Welcome, guys. It's so nice to see all of your faces up there. In terms of the next item on the agenda for the meeting is the objectives of the workshop. We have started receiving, we've received now the outputs from the iFEED process. We received for Malawi, Tanzania, Zambia, and it's only today that we got the outputs for South Africa finally. We've been anxiously waiting for those. And tomorrow we have the policy workshop when we are supposed to be sharing those outputs with our stakeholders from the 4 project countries as well as from the region. But we felt that the iFEED coordinators as well as the node the iFEED champions and the node coordinators, before we go into the policy workshop, we needed to have a good understanding of the outputs before we start sharing them out with the stakeholders starting from tomorrow, as well as after tomorrow, when you go back to your respective countries, we want you to fully internalize those outputs. So we felt we needed to organize a separate meeting where we can have a session between the iFEED champions, the node coordinators, and the Team C leads who have been producing these outputs for us so that we can engage with them and make sure we fully understand those outputs before we start championing them, before we start leading the process of disseminating them. So this is the session that we're going to go into with the Team C leads for them to give us a summary. Yes, we've received the documents. Yes, we've reviewed the documents. Yes, we've given our feedback, but let's give them a few minutes to each one of them, the 4 Team C leads, to give us a very quick rundown of what those outputs are saying to us, so that when we go into the meeting tomorrow, as well as after the meeting tomorrow, when we go back to our countries, as well as us at regional level, we will be competent enough to be able to share those results. So that is the basic purpose why we organize these meetings. And thank you, Tembi, for allowing us the budget. It was not budgeted for these 2 meetings today and tomorrow, but sweet talking Tembi, she allowed us to actually bring you guys here. So it has been possible. So I think in those hopefully few words, let's move on to the next item on the agenda, where we are going to start getting our Team C leads to share with us those outputs. Maybe if we start with Claire, if you can come in. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to see you all. My name is Claire Quinn. Hopefully, most of you have come across me already. I am the Team C lead, but also I'm the country rep for Zambia. So I've been working on pulling together the policy summaries for Zambia, alongside Helen Harwitz, who's on the call, who's been working on the Malawi policy summaries, and Marcelene Tonya Mahop, who's also on the call, who's been working very hard on the Tanzania summaries. And Helen has also been helping to pull together the South Africa summaries. So apologies that they came this morning, but hopefully you have started to get a chance to have a look at them. And so I think what we have been doing is sort of trying to prepare for the presentations tomorrow. So I don't know whether there was a particular plan in terms of how we would run through things today, in order to kind of give you guys a kind of, I guess, a sneak preview of the things that we've been doing, and to open up discussions with you as country champions, and to start getting your feedback on the documents that we've started to pull together. And apologies, I was away last week for a family bereavement, so I'm coming in a little late to the show as well. So I don't know whether we had a particular plan for any of the presentations today, or whether I should just leap into presenting the policy summary documents. Hands up, anybody who had any thoughts about what we were going to do.
Right. The idea was that we get you guys, we give you, did you agree on 10 minutes? I think if my memory serves me right, you give us a very quick rundown on the outputs, what are the main findings, and
Okay.
what are the key messages that are coming out from there. Then we go into a bit of a discussion. And I'm wondering whether we should do 1 in 10, or we just get the 4 teams leads to quickly give us your 10-minute summaries. Then we have a general discussion. Maybe it would be better that I don't know.
Yeah, we let's try that. I mean, let's open it up maybe to the people who are in the room, which they would prefer. Would they prefer 10 minutes discussion, 10 minutes discussion, or we'll do our whole presentation and then we'll do one big discussion at the end?
What do we think is best for us, guys? After all the presentations, agreed? Okay, perfect. The agreement here is that let's get all the 4 presentations, then we go into a discussion after we hear from all the 4 team leads. Thank you.
Okay, so these presentations are still definitely a work in progress, and we haven't kind of pulled everything together yet. So we'll do the best that we can. Marcelin, I realise that your presentation is separate at the moment, whereas I've been combining the other ones. So Marcelin, do you want to start first with yours and Tanzania?
Yes, I will. I think this is sort of taking maybe I misread the objectives and of the 2 workshops. I wasn't preparing this presentation for today. in reality, I was actually preparing it for tomorrow. But yes, I will. I can share it if possible. Share screen. Okay. So, having difficulties sharing this. Just give me a moment. So.
as we wait for Marceline to come online with his presentation, there's been a suggestion that you guys online might want to know who we have around the room. So I'll quickly go around with the mic and you know who is here with us.
My name is Andrew Jamali from Malawi, champion for iFEED in Malawi. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Pamela Kuwali from Sisamet, Malawi.
Hello, I'm Sue Walker from South Africa.
Hello, I'm Dakius Bashir, DQ, iFEED champion Malawi.
Hello, I'm Winfred Mbungu, iFEED champion Tanzania.
Hi, I'm Vivian Kazi from ESRF, Alfarapa Node, but also part of AFRICAP Tanzania.
Gerard Tunzo from Tanzania. I work with the Minister of Agriculture.
Good day, colleagues. Namandande Yeke from the NAMC in South Africa.
I'm Shiluanganyani from Fanapan.
Hello, it's Tembi Momakamba from Fanapan.
I also want to recognize the presence online of our regional iFEED champion, Nalishabo Mebelo. I've seen you are with us in this meeting. Go ahead, Marceline.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope my slides are seen now.
Yes.
Okay. So thanks for giving me the platform. So basically, what in relation to Tanzania, what we've been doing is to, as a Team C country representative, I was particularly focused on helping, you know, the scenario workshops when they were being conducted, but specifically in relation to the iFEED process itself. The work that has been done over the past few months was linked to the development of the implication statements, preparation for the policy integration workshop, the iFEED integration workshop in June, from which we, as country representative, we had to develop the scenario summaries based on the descriptors and the implication statements that were developed by members of the team, and the country summaries, which are going to be sort of comparing the various scenarios, the 4 scenarios in the case of each country. Just to recall that in the case of Tanzania, the scenarios came up with, you know, 4 possible futures, you know, using the 2, you know, most critical uncertainties that were were thought during the workshop to affect, you know, food systems, you know, looking towards 2050, which were the climate risk and the technological transformation of the country of food system relevant technologies. So with these 2 criteria, 4 different scenarios were discussed. Where first one was, you know, the intensive vulnerability scenario, which is characterized by high climate risk and, you know, high, you know, technological transformation, and climate chaos characterized by, you know, high climate risk with technological stagnation, where there is no a great deal of movement in terms of development and adoption of new technology, new food system related technologies. Then the human capital scenario, which is characterized by, you know, the low climate risk and low technological stagnation. And the techno-fix scenario, which is the future characterized by, you know, the high climate risk and and high technology, low climate risk and significant technological transformation. So what we are seeing in this slide is, put together side by side, the characteristics of these scenarios as discussed during the workshop, and reported in in the scenario in the reports that are available. And the first results of the food and food production and crop modeling in respect of how these futures, how the circumstances that are going to prevail in these futures are going to affect, crop production, land use, etc., etc. And I'm going to come down onto these things specifically when in the next slides on the. So I just mentioned also the workshop, the integration workshop that that happened in June, in June, during which basic guidance to the workshop was the policy, the policy topics or the priority policy areas that are prevalent in each of the countries. And in the case of Tanzania, what we we discussed we came up with about 4 clusters of priority food system policy areas for the country, and these were also discussed with our Tanzanian colleagues, including agricultural productivity and climate resilience and sustainability. Second one would be in commercialization and community value chain development. The third one being adoption of modern and new technology factors of production. And the fourth one is improved nutrition. So the reason why each of these scenarios, each of these policy area was chosen was because if you look at across most of the existing policy instrument in Tanzania, most of them really touch on these issues as some of the key development issues that Tanzania is trying to solve, to address, and to pursue. But not only the policy instruments, also the discussions that happened during the scenario workshop also really revealed most of these areas. So what we've done then is to use for the various scenario workshops, or the 4 quadrants that were agreed were discussed during the workshop. In the case of Tanzania, we've used the 4 climate smartness criteria, climate smart, to sort of summarize how do they play out in the context of the of the climatic and technological circumstances that are described in each of the scenarios. And so this is what we are going to see, and going through the various key areas of the descriptors that were developed by some of the colleagues. But then the next step was to have the whole country summary, which is going to compare the various, the 4 quadrants, each other, how, each of the key elements that is addressed in terms of food production, for instance. How does it compare from maybe the climate chaos scenario to maybe the techno-fix scenario we are looking towards 2050. So then here you have so the four quadrants, and looking at the agricultural yes, looking at the the climate chaos, high climate risk, technological stagnation, some of the key issues that come up is that, for instance, food production is going to be under serious stress in this scenario. But there would be some slight increase in terms of production because of land expansion. But there's also going to be significant yield losses, for instance, for potatoes, maize, granules, and which is caused by basically due to the fact that there is not enough adaptation in the context of this scenario. So, but there are also going to be some social and environmental impacts, in terms of, potential conflict with regards to the use of, the conflicting priorities for which development purpose, land or water should be used in the future. So coming down to maybe the human capital, which is low climate risk and technological stagnation. So we are going to have an increase in the number of years of yield shocks, for instance, about 50% in the case of, for instance, if the scenario was, this project was going to happen, in the case of maize and granules, but with very high shocks, yield shocks with regards to soybean, for instance. But there is going to be a marginal increase in food production in the context of this scenario. Again, this one is linked to largely to the expansion in cropland and pasture land. So in the context of this scenario, there is the likelihood that adaptation, mitigation, and broader development, outcomes are not going to be met. They are going to be under serious challenge. But the fact that there is going to be significant, marginal increase in production does not necessarily mean that it's going to be sustainable, precisely because of the other factors that are not met, that adaptation is not to the standard that is supposed to be. Moving on to the intensive vulnerability scenario, which is characterized by high climate risk and technological transformation. Here again, we see a considerable increase in crop production and livestock production. This time, this is associated with serious expansion in cropland and pasture land, but also with technological transformation. But this can be at the expense of other issues, adaptation and mitigation to climate change, which are not necessarily met because of technological expansion, technological transformation. So And in terms of the highlight for the Technofix, scenario, which is characterized by low climate risk and technological transformation. Here, also we see a significant increase in food production, both crop and livestock. Broadly speaking, we could say the issue of food insecurity is not likely, although everything can change with regards to climate, because when we're talking about low climate risk, does not necessarily mean that what we are seeing today is going to be what will happen. The climate, situation, climate change situation in 2050 is going to be better than what it is today. But it simply means that it's not going to be the worst kind of climate extremes scenario, which means there is going to be some climate extremes as well, and which can take the baton at any time. So we have also the development and uptake of improved varieties and use of irrigation system that it's going to help a lot in maintaining some degree of adaptation to the prevailing climate risk. So for each of the quadrants, the main recommendation is to really look into policy development that can address the shortcomings that are observed in each of the scenarios. So,
just to say that we're over the 10 minutes now, Marcelin, so if you could get to your final comments, or is that where you are?
Yes. Well, the final comment is really about the last slide, which is which compares the four scenarios. And I think in terms of the highlights, looking across the four scenarios, is that all the scenarios project some degree of food production increase, and all of these are largely associated with land expansion. But it doesn't mean that there is not going to be any difficulty in terms of food security, food and nutrition security. In general, the climate smartness criteria are going to struggle seriously in 2050 unless some significant shift in terms of specific policies to address those shortcomings are met. So thanks for listening, and any questions? Yes, we are still on the call.
Great, thank you, Marcelin. If you could stop sharing your screen, then I can start sharing mine.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I have the slides for our other countries. So hopefully you should now be able to see those. Helen, I think you were going to start us off. I think I've got South Africa and Malawi together, so hopefully you should be able to run through yours. So,
yeah, great. Thanks, Claire, and hello, everybody. It's really good to see you all. First of all, just apologies again about the delay in getting the South Africa outputs to you. One of our colleagues has been off sick, so Stuart and I were able to pick those up last week and finish them off to get them to you. So just to quickly run through, and next slide, please. And next one. Yeah, that one, thank you. So first of all, again, we have the four scenarios that describe the four contrasting and comprehensive futures for the South Africa food system. again derived from the participatory workshop. So these 4 scenarios are characterized by the magnitude of climate risk ranging from low to high, and land reform ranging from low to no reform, going up to significant land reform. So in scenario 1, the familiar futures, this is characterized by low climate risks and low to no land reform. And this future assumes little change to arable crop areas, but increased livestock pasture and crop diversification. Scenario 2, structural change, is characterized by low climate risks and high land reform. And this future assumes crop diversification and a fall in arable crop areas and an increase in livestock pasture areas. Scenario 3, hot and bothered, is characterized by high climate risks and low to no land reform. So this future assumes crop diversification and an increase in arable crop areas and irrigation expansion and a decrease in livestock pasture areas. And finally, scenario 4, all change, is characterized by high climate risks and high land reform. And this future assumes crop diversification, fall in agricultural area, and irrigation expansion. So just to kind of make it really clear, the substantial agricultural land reform doesn't occur in the LT scenarios, or those 2 across the bottom, only in the HT scenarios, or those 2 in the top row. Extreme conditions are likely to increase across all of the scenarios, potentially making relatively bad years in terms of domestic food production more likely. So if we go to the next slide, I'll just run through some of the key messages on food production, land use and irrigation. So crop yields on average increase by more than 50% from the baseline across all scenarios, even after taking into account climate impacts. Climate change exerts a small negative impact on maize, soybean and potato yields of around 4% in the low climate risk scenarios, up to 14% in the high climate risk scenarios, even with autonomous adaptation. So yield shock rates remain similar to the baseline in the low climate risk scenarios and largely decrease in the high climate risk scenarios due to the application of technology. Maize remains the main crop in all scenarios, but crop diversity does increase, with portions of cropland previously used for maize, so around 10% in the low climate risk scenarios, increasing to 25% in the high risk scenarios, instead used for other crops. Food production also increases in all scenarios through increased intensification, and in the 2 scenarios with low land reform, changes in food production range from a doubling to more than a doubling in the high climate risk scenarios. Crop production increases by around 117% to around 178% in the high climate risk scenarios. Meat production increases from around 122 to 130, and dairy production increases across a range of 123 in the high climate risk to 155 in the low climate risk. Changes in food production increase substantially compared to the baseline as a result of crop diversification in the scenarios, with the addition of technological innovation to improve yields and an increase in livestock pasture area in the low climate risk scenarios. And in addition, for the high climate risk scenarios, adaptation measures and an expansion of crop area and irrigation also help to increase yields. So land conflicts are expected to increase between livestock and crop production in all scenarios, and a decline in ecosystem services and environmental sustainability and health outcomes would be expected due to the expansion of agricultural land. So in the 2 scenarios with high land reform, changes in food production also range from a doubling to more than a doubling, and crop production increases by around 100% to 140%, meat production from around 120 to 125, and dairy production from around 103 to 116. So these changes increase substantially compared to the baseline in both scenarios as a result of climate change, adaptation, technological innovation, and crop diversification. And additionally, in the low climate risk scenarios, pasture areas are extended and irrigation increases in the high climate risk scenarios. And in the low climate risk scenarios, land conflicts are expected to increase between livestock and crop production and between conservation, tourism and pastureland, for example. A decline again in ecosystem services and environmental sustainability and health outcomes would be expected due to the pastureland expansion. And conversely, in the high climate risk scenario, crop and pasture areas decline by 10 and 15% respectively, with potential for improving environmental sustainability and health outcomes. So the way that land reforms implemented in South Africa could impact land use and food production. So for example, in the low climate risk scenario with high land reform, without sufficient support and advice from the government, small to medium scale farmers who receive land through redistribution programs may struggle to cultivate the land and access supply chains. Conversely, with the support as set out in the 2019 National Development Plan, mechanisation could increase in addition to global market access, increasing overall production. Industrial agriculture focused on commodity crops would increase together with an increase in fertiliser and pesticide use, with fewer people involved in farming overall, employed in farming overall. So in the two scenarios with the highest climate impacts, the demand for irrigation water increases substantially from 67% to 84%. And therefore, in both of those scenarios, water conflicts are expected to increase between agricultural users and downstream consumers. In the low climate risk scenarios, there's likely to be no significant changes to pests and disease impacts unless government-backed land reform leads to increasing homogenisation of agricultural systems, which would likely result in increased pest and disease pressures. In the high climate risk scenarios, pest and disease impacts are likely to worsen due to climate change, essentially resulting in around a 13% crop yield loss, with a possible increased reliance on pesticides and therefore a resulting decline in environmental sustainability. So these impacts are likely to be exacerbated if government-backed land reform leads to increasing homogenisation of agricultural systems. So in terms of trade and nutrition, with increased food production and crop diversity, an increased availability of nutritionally diverse food crops, lower food prices, and increased livelihood resilience might be expected across all four scenarios, which could improve food security outcomes through the reductions in yields for subsistence crops are likely to lead to increased food security. Across all four scenarios, population level nutrition supply in 2050 is projected to remain adequate for most nutrients. However, calcium and iron remain inadequate. On a per person basis, nutrient supply generally improves compared to the 2000 baseline level. And if nutrition security is optimized using trade in all scenarios, a significant amount of calories produced could be exported without compromising essential micronutrient supplies for domestic consumption. In terms of climate extremes, extreme conditions are likely to increase across all scenarios. And there are some differences in terms of temperature expectations by mid-century. So in the low climate risk, the average warming is around 1 degree, whereas in the high climate risk, the average warming is around 2.5 degrees, with differences in terms of the extremely hot days and the number of those per month compared to present day. And also some shortening of the rainy season across South Africa and reduced average rainfall amount during the wet months of October to April. In terms of climate smartness, these are quite mixed as productivity increases through intensification of all production systems, but net emissions increase in all four scenarios, ranging from 57% to 60% in the low climate impact scenarios and up to 120% to 150% in the high climate impact scenarios. Non-CO2 emissions of methane and nitrous oxides also increase across all scenarios by around 50%, and soil organic carbon losses occur in all scenarios as well. Emissions intensity, so the emissions produced per unit of food produced, also declines in all scenarios except in the high climate, high land reform scenario, where it actually increases by around 5%. So that is the summary for South Africa. Claire, did you want me to carry on straight to the Malawi summary? Yep. Okay, great.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Right. So similar situation in terms of the format of what I'll present. So again, we have those 4 scenarios. So we have the next slide, please. Thank you. So they again were derived from the participatory workshop. So we have scenario 1, demanding but coping, which is characterized by high climate risk and high policy implementation effectiveness. This future assumes crop diversification and increase in food production. So the key difference here between the South Africa scenarios and the Malawi scenarios is that in South Africa, the other axis was land reform, whereas here it's policy effectiveness. I can't actually, oh, there we go, it's back. The slide just disappeared for a second. In scenario 2, Path to Heaven, this scenario is characterized by low climate risk and high policy implementation effectiveness. This future assumes crop diversification and increase in food production. In scenario 3, Road to Hell, this scenario, as you might imagine, is characterized by high climate risk and low policy implementation effectiveness. And this future assumes a decline in food production and no crop diversification. And finally, in scenario 4, we have degrading economy. Yeah, that should be scenario 4 on that diagram. So this scenario is characterized by low climate risk and low policy implementation effectiveness. And it assumes little change to food production and crop diversification. So a business as usual type scenario. Next slide, please. So again, extreme conditions are likely to increase across all of the scenarios, making relatively bad years in food production, in terms of food production, more likely. So just to give a little bit more detail on food production, land use and irrigation. So in the 2 scenarios with the low implementation effectiveness, changes in food production range from around minus 14% to minus 1% for crops, minus 13% to minus 1% for meat production, and an increase of 2% to 6% for dairy production. Maize continues to occupy the largest cropland area, and the agricultural land area, so that's arable land pasture, varies from relatively unchanged in the low climate risk scenario to a 10% reduction in the high climate risk scenario. Land conflicts are expected to increase between livestock and crop production, and in the 2 scenarios with high implementation effectiveness, changes in food production increase substantially compared to the baseline through intensification and homogenization of agricultural production. So those increases range from around 719% in the high climate risk scenario to 728% in the low climate risk scenario for crops, 151% to 152% for meat, and 237% to 243% for dairy production. Intensification of agricultural production could accelerate soil erosion and carbon loss, potentially exacerbating soil degradation and fertility. So crop diversity is largely different from the baseline. All crops have an equal cropland area with a large diversification away from maize. Agricultural land area increases substantially in both scenarios. So with the expansion of cropland and pasture land, woodlands could actually come under pressure in these scenarios, including the Mayombo woodlands, which are not actually classed as forests, which puts them at higher risk from being protected or not being protected, with potentially adverse implications for biodiversity and soil carbon if the forest were to be replaced with agriculture. Again, land conflicts are expected to increase, so between livestock and crop production and non-agricultural users. A decline in environmental sustainability and health outcomes are also expected. Impacts on crop yields vary across the scenarios, ranging from a mean yield decrease for most crops in the high climate scenario and low policy effectiveness scenario to a more than doubling in the low climate risk and high policy effectiveness scenario. So without adaptation to climate change, maize yields are expected to decline by around 30% to 19% across many regions in the low policy effectiveness scenarios. Crop yield change is driven by climate change only in those scenarios, so there's no technological improvements assumed. Yields of non-maize crops such as soybean could potentially increase due to increased CO2 levels in the atmosphere, and compared to the present day, significant yield penalties are expected to occur around 2 to 3 times more frequently for maize and groundnut. In the two scenarios with high implementation effectiveness, the area under irrigation increases substantially. In the two scenarios with low implementation effectiveness, changes to irrigation demand range from a decrease of around 10% to an increase of around 13%. And in all scenarios except the low climate, low policy effectiveness scenario, there's an expected increase in competition for water with a likely rise in conflict between agricultural users and downstream consumers. So in the low climate risk, low policy effectiveness, there's no significant changes to crop and livestock pests and diseases. In the high climate risk, low policy effectiveness scenario, elevated CO2 levels could alter the type of disease prevalent, and high daily temperatures could actually increase disease incidence, likely resulting in higher crop damage and yield losses and an increased need for veterinary services to deal with heat stroke, for example, in livestock. In the two scenarios with high implementation effectiveness, an increase in crop pest and disease prevalence and damage results from the modernization of agricultural systems, intensive cultivation, monocropping, and a reduction in biological control. So such production circumstances could also facilitate introduction of and establishment of novel transboundary pests and diseases and invasive species that could have a devastating impact on production. So resultantly, a high use and reliance on chemical inputs is expected, so pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, which increase food production costs and potentially water pollution as well. Additionally, climate change will increase the susceptibility of crop pests and disease, induce crop damages and yield losses by facilitating an increase in the distribution and prevalence, especially in the highland areas of Malawi. So in terms of trade and nutrition security, two scenarios with low implementation effectiveness, food security is not achieved for most nutrients. And if relying on trade to achieve food and nutrition security, around 59% of calories would need to come from imports. Reliance on domestic production for nutrition security may actually be hampered by increased costs of agricultural production and a lack of crop diversity, loss of crops due to pests and disease, and also cassava toxicity, which could increase fourfold in the high climate scenarios. Income reductions could also be an issue due to, for example, yield losses and widening wealth-based inequalities in nutrition outcomes could actually occur. Potential consequences of nutrition insecurity include an increased reliance on food aid, detrimental health impacts, and declines in labour productivity. So overall, rural vulnerabilities, poverty, and social inequalities may be exacerbated by inequitable and insecure land tenure. So quite a few different issues going on in relation to food and nutrition security. In the two scenarios with the high implementation effectiveness, food and nutrition security is achieved for most nutrients, and around half of calories produced could actually be exported if optimizing using trade. So diverse cropping systems may enhance yield stability, food security, and climate variability buffering. However, annual droughts could actually result in a fourfold increase in cassava toxicity in both scenarios, which could pose health risks and necessitate reduction in consumption of cassava. So due to policy intervention, no significant changes expected in maize aflatoxin contamination, and higher food availability could in turn reduce food prices and increase affordability. However, there is increased risk of extreme climate events and severe losses due to crop pests and diseases, meaning relatively bad years in food production could become more common under those high climate risk scenarios. So in terms of climate extremes, extreme conditions are likely across all scenarios, making food production bad years of food production relatively more likely. In the two scenarios with low implementation, effectively increases in average temperatures, as well as more frequent temperature and rainfall extremes increase the chance of yield shocks and yield variability. This combined with a lack of agricultural diversity are the key factors that actually lower resilience and increase vulnerability in these two scenarios. Conversely, in the high implementation effectiveness scenarios, the effective design and strategic implementation of policy and high technology investments, such as irrigation use and promotion of diverse cropping systems, improve farmer access to enhanced cultivars and promotion of climate smart technologies, substantially improve yield and reduce yield shocks by 2050. And finally, in terms of climate smartness, the key differences are that non-CO2 emissions decrease under the low policy effectiveness scenarios and increase under the high policy effective scenarios, whereas net greenhouse gas emissions increase under the low policy scenarios and decrease under the high policy effective scenarios. Soil organic carbon decreases under the low effectiveness scenarios and increases under the high policy effectiveness scenarios, and emissions intensity increases under the low policy effective scenarios and decreases under the high policy effective scenarios. So that is where I will end on Malawi. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Okay, so then I will round us out with the Zambia Policy Outputs Review. And apologies again that these are all still being developed before the workshop tomorrow. So so my notes are not written down. So I will do the best that I can with these outputs and summarising these. So as in the case of all of the other countries, we have a set of scenarios for Zambia, which came out of a workshop that we ran in Zambia back in 2018. And like all of the other scenarios, one of our axes is from high climate risk to low climate risk. And then in the case of Zambia, we go from low market connectivity and function up to high market connectivity and function. So this creates our four scenarios for Zambia. So we have isolation and imperative, so high climate risk and low market connectivity. And it's assumed here that we have crop diversification and irrigation expansion, but a fall in the agricultural area. So our second scenario is risk and reward. So our high climate risk again, but high market connectivity this time. So we assume that agriculture and irrigation will expand, that we'll see a concurrent loss in crop diversity, so more commercialization, so monocropping, and significant increases in imports and exports under this scenario. Then scenario 3 is this solitude and self-sufficiency scenario. So here we're looking at low climate risks this time, but also low market connectivity. So this assumes that we don't really see very many changes in agriculture from the current situation, except for potentially some additional crop diversification. And then the final scenario is the opportunity and exposure scenario. So here it's characterized again by low climate risk, but we have high market connectivity. So here we're assuming expansion of arable and pasture land, an expansion of irrigation, increased diversification, and increased exports. So those are the 4 scenarios that we have for Zambia. And we've explored in Zambia too what each of those scenarios means. But some key messages in terms of looking at it from a country level. So under all of those scenarios, we see average temperatures increasing in Zambia. So an increasing frequency of temperature extremes and a general shortening of the rainy season in Zambia. So the length of the rainy season will get shorter. No matter whether we have a low climate or a high climate risk scenario. These changes to climate will decrease crop yields and increase the occurrence and frequency of yield shocks. And we've talked about yield shocks in other places too. So the number of years that we see yields drop significantly from where they should be will increase by 2050. But effective implementation of irrigation, improved crop varieties, about connecting to the market will significantly mitigate the effects of climate change. So whether we have high or low climate risks, we'll see climate change and we'll see impacts in terms of yield shocks and decreasing yields. But if we see market connectivity, implementation of irrigation and improved crop varieties, that will mitigate whether we have high or low climate risks. Across all of our scenarios, so all 4 scenarios, nutrition security is not achieved for all nutrients by 2050. And so that's a really important message to take home, I think, for Zambia, that regardless of whether we see low climate risks, so even if we manage to keep climate change to a minimum, we're not necessarily going to be able to achieve nutrition security by 2050. And that is in part driven by the increases in population that we're expecting. So market connectivity will be an important determinant of the proportion of calories that we need to import in order to be able to meet that demand. So not going to be able to produce enough within Zambia. So we're going to need to import some of those calories to meet the demand and to meet all of those nutritional requirements. So that might range from 23% in our high climate risk scenarios with high market connectivity through to 82% in our high climate risk scenario with low market connectivity. So the extent to which the food system in Zambia is connected to the market will have real implications in terms of being able to meet food and nutrition security in the future, regardless of the climate risks. And so it's evident that investment in research and development is really key in terms of implementing effective policy, farm technologies, varieties, traits, irrigation, all of those things, including inclusive and sustainable access to markets, if we're going to be able to mitigate the effects of climate change on agriculture in Zambia. Diversification will be really important to realise yield gains. So that will help to mitigate against the losses caused by climate change and the potential increase in pests and diseases. So if we move towards a monocrop, real high commercialisation of agriculture, homogenisation of the environment, then the likelihood is that pests and diseases will become a bigger burden. But diversification into non-maize crops might provide a significant opportunity to gain yields and also improve nutritional outcomes. And the availability and affordability of all of these new farm technologies will determine whether all farmers can realise the benefits. So we're really going to have to think about how we provide that significant support to farmers through financing, extension, weather services, and so on, so that they can kind of realise all the benefits that might be available. So that was a really quick whistle-stop tour of Zambia. And I just wanted to finish with some things that we're thinking about in terms of the next steps. So we've worked quite hard on developing scenario summaries, which you will have seen. So we've got lots of detailed information about characterizing what those different scenarios will look like from the modelling and expert opinion, and lots of work done by the broader AFRICAP team and others. So we've done that scenarios work. We've done the country summaries, which we've talked a little bit about today, which is trying to kind of pull key messages out of those scenario summaries. And now we're trying to think about the kind of cross-cutting policy topic summaries that will be the kind of next step up from all of this information that we're deriving. And we're thinking about these at a kind of regional level rather than at a country level. We did have lots of discussions, which many of you will have been involved in, looking at where the kind of priority policy topic areas might be for each of the countries. And we kind of pulled together all of that information from all of those discussions into a kind of little table matrix here, where we've got all of the kind of different topics and the different countries, so that we can kind of see where potential overlaps are and where we can kind of bring things together in ways that that make sense. And so from this, we've drawn up a short list of these 4 policy topics, which is the next sort of round of work that we're working on. But we're really keen to get feedback and thoughts from you as well. So the policy topics that we're kind of considering in terms of trying to pull together some summaries for are around agricultural resilience and thinking about what that looks like and what that means under those different climate risks. Looking specifically at agricultural commercialization, so thinking about technologies, thinking about all of those things that kind of link into commercialization, again, under climate risk and what that means under different levels of climate risk. To unpack more in terms of that new nutrition and food security under climate risks and try to bring together all of that information, and then land use change and reform under climate risk. So a lot of the scenarios that we talk about, there is some land use change. There is expansion or contraction of agricultural pasture land. There's kind of changing the land use, as well as reform in terms of smallholders versus commercialization, shifting in terms of privatization of land and so on. So we wanted to bring all of those discussions together and consider them as a kind of regional policy topic area, again, under climate risk. So thinking about those in terms of low and high climate risks. And for all of those, we want to think about what the policy barriers are, what prevents things from happening in a way that enables a sustainable and climate smart pathway, and the policy enablers. So what are the things within policy that can support transitions in ways that are sustainable and climate smart? So that's the kind of next step. And yeah, again, we're keen to get your thoughts and ideas on those topics and other things that we should be thinking about. And I think that brings us to the end of those summaries. And thank you very much for your attention over what is quite a lot of information, but hopefully you've had a chance to have a look at the summaries that we've provided for you.
Thank you very much, Marceline, Helen, and Claire, for that feedback, sharing with us those outputs. Consider today a dry run. We gave you 10 minutes each. Tomorrow it will be 5 minutes during the policy workshop. So we want to see how well you are going to do tomorrow. Colleagues, those are the outputs for 4 countries, and it's time for discussion, feedback. Yes. Yes, we can go around the room. Okay. Oh, sorry, Evie, your microphone.
Thank you very much for the very elaborate and detailed presentations. This kind of a lot of work that's gone into all this. And I think that shouldn't be taken for granted. That's quite impressive piece of work. Congratulations to the team. Having said that, I think I might have some specific questions to Malawi scenarios, but I think it would be premature to bring them out now. I'm actually thinking that I might have to engage with you in a one-to-one discussion on some of the things, kind of just firming them up because as champions, I think our engagement with the wider stakeholder community must be really very well grounded in terms of preparations. We're talking about policy convictions here, and the space out there is comprised of so many actors on the ground with different, varied viewpoints about these projections and analysis that's come out. And we also know that pushing up a policy proposition is quite an insurmountable kind of work. So we need to be so firm when we're approaching these kind of spaces. Having said that, that was just a preamble. But having said that, let me just bring out two general questions. The first one relates to the probabilities associated with the projections. I'm having to think about myself presenting these scenarios to a group of academics and researchers that are also doing similar kind of work. And they're asking me how probable are these climatic, and climatic, events, or maybe the estimations on emissions that we're talking about and the resultant impacts on food security and nutrition. What are the probabilities of each of these propositions? So that's a purely scientific question, and it gives a lot of confidence. And strictly for my country, now that we're moving into a knowledge-based economy with a new vision, Malawi 2063, the issue of being certain using scientific evidence is quite key. So if at all there could be something that can pertain to giving us confidence in a scientific way over these proposed, or not proposed, but actually emerging projections that are coming out, that would also give us a bit of a stamina to withstand any pressure that might come along that direction. The second one relates to specific climatic extremes that are associated with each of the scenarios. So I know that as scientists, we are so much interested to present them as RCP, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But we're talking about a policy arena here where people would want to really know what are the issues associated with these climatic extremes that we're talking about. We might want to be clear about that as well, whether we're talking about increased incidences of extreme rainfall in terms of floods, or extreme droughts, or maybe some landslides and mudslides that are eroding potential soils for agriculture production and stuff like that. If these were factored in the model and they appear to be dominant in terms of influencing the climatic outcomes over time, then we might need to specify that from a policy perspective. The last one, which I might want just to build up on what I've said, is, you see, climatic effects are kind of varied from one spatial location to another, with different time spans and intensities. I know that our propositions, the scenarios that we're putting in place, are talking in general for a country, but a country has got a varied geographical experience. So for example, in my country, I know that I've done some kind of analysis that shows rainfall season starts in the south, progresses to the center, moves towards the north of the region. That's how the climatic outlook is like. It's the same way the climatic instances that are classified as extremes or whatever might vary from one spatial scale to another. Now, in that kind of regard, we might want to be thinking about context-specific policy propositions. I'm not so sure how much iFEED could go deeper into such kind of analysis. We're looking at agroecological zones, because when we are making these policy propositions, for example, issues to do with crop diversification and the like, those will follow along, geographical, ecological zones, whatever, livelihoods and whatsoever. Is our model robust enough to capture such kind of spatial localities and their policy implications, so that in the end, We are talking about a context-specific policy proposition. Thank you. Let me pause there.
Thank you. That's lots and lots of food for thought. Before I jump in, Stuart, I wondered whether you or wanted to kind of say anything in relation to some of the sort of modelling type questions.
Sure, thanks, Claire, and thanks, Andrew. There's some really important points there. So I was just trying to make some notes as you were talking. So the first was a question about how confident we are in our projections and the probability associated with them. So yeah, that's a really important point. So I mean, I think actually to zoom out, in a way to answer all of your questions, what we've just presented is obviously the really high level, country level highlights. But under the bonnet, there's a lot of detail. So firstly, thinking about the probability and uncertainty in the projections, we spent a lot of time in the modelling side of things, forming what we were calling calibrated statements. And these were all associated with a specific level of confidence. So I think particularly once we get to the policy recommendation stage, if we are going to focus on any particular, say, numbers in the projections, we can fall back on those. And to give you an example, we have a high level of confidence in some of our yield projections, and that's based on both our own kind of internal expertise looking at how the modelling was done, but also comparing the modelling that we have done to other modelling in the literature, in the wider scientific literature, so we can have a certain level of confidence based on these things. So talking about the specifics of climate extremes again, if you look at some of the documents that have been shared at the scenario and country level, there'll be the specifics there about what those variables are that we're talking about. So for example, I know colleagues at the Met Office in the UK have looked at the number of days over 35 degrees that are changing in the growing season, and also looking at extremes of rainfall, as you said, sort of looking at floods and droughts. So in general, of course, things are getting warmer and we're seeing more days over, for example, 35 degrees, and that you can say a key threshold for maize in this case. And it's more country and region specific as to what's happening with rainfall. And that's one thing we do have a bit less confidence in, because climate models can tend to disagree at times in how rainfall is changing. So that's a good example of having to sort of nuance the policy message probably in that case. But we are confident in general that extremes are increasing, and pretty much across the board for low climate risk, things are going to get slightly worse in that respect. But particularly say with rainfall, we're not particularly confident in some cases about the direction of change. But with high climate risk, we are pretty confident that, say, yield shocks are going to increase because of these extremes. And also, yeah, thinking about the geographic variation. So as you said, Andrew, a lot of the modelling is focused on the national scale. However, we do have underpinning that a lot of spatially explicit gridded output, particularly for yields and emissions. So if there are particularly important sort of areas of policy, we can look again at those results and think about things in different areas of different countries. So in some cases, we've of course done some of that work already. Again, thinking about work done at the Met Office as well as the crop modelling. But as you said, I think we'll have to have kind of specific follow-up conversations about some of these things to drill into some of the details.
Great, thank you, Stuart. I think just to come in and reiterate on Stuart's what Stuart highlighted, that I think there are definitely some clearer statements about the specific climate extremes and what we would expect under the different scenarios in the documents that we've produced. So we talk about what that means in terms of what the evidence is saying about rainfall or temperature extremes or changes to the growing season and so on. So some of that detail is in the documents that we've circulated. What I also wanted to kind of highlight in response to some of your first comments was that these are definitely draft documents. They are working documents, and we are circulating them to you guys and have been circulating them to you guys over the last few weeks, because we want you to engage with us, to have those discussions, to give us direction, to collaborate with the wider AFRICAP team in developing them so that they make sense for the context that you understand better than anybody as the champions for your countries. So this is just the first step on that process of developing these into documents that are useful and that can be adapted for your particular circumstances. So I would absolutely say to all of the champions who are there to follow up and speak to us and maybe arrange one-to-ones and really get involved in the development of the next iteration of these summary documents, because this is not the final version. This is just the first version, which we really need your inputs into.
Thanks, Claire. And if I could maybe just add one quick thing I forgot to say, perhaps importantly about on the uncertainty side of things. Of course, that's a reason why we've kind of gone down this scenario framework approach, because in lots of ways, we're unsure what's going to happen. Therefore, we've tried to look at quite contrasting possible futures. So at the end of the day, at the end of this process, we can have those kind of fairly robust country level messages that are coming out of the process. As Claire was saying, we're still kind of early days on that front, but the whole idea is to have a kind of series of key recommendations that are quite robust to these quite uncertain outcomes.
Yeah, because we can't know what the future will look like. But hopefully what we want to do is, given all of these scenarios and the possible futures, whether it's high or low climate risk and high or low technologies or market connectivity or land reform or so on, that the decisions that are made now, the policy advice that we give now is a kind of win-win. If you do this, if we end up in a high climate risk scenario or a low climate risk scenario, it will still be a beneficial thing to do.
Thank you so much. Firstly, I would like to agree with Andrew on his observations, especially about Malawi. And as he was speaking, I recollected that somewhere, and I'll specifically highlight the example of Malawi, that I saw somewhere, somebody was giving a projection of how exponentially population is expected to grow by 2050. And the figure for Malawi was 44 million. I think right now we are near 20 million. So we are near 20 million, but over the last 10 years, we have not been able to produce food enough for the entire population. Even this year, after government put substantial effort in providing inputs, we still have a caseload of over 1 million people that are at risk of food insecurity. And with the recent developments, it could be more. Now, when I think about the iFEED process, I think it shouldn't just be a technical process or activity that we are doing as part of the project. But I think it is very crucial for the 4 countries that are involved, but also for the entire Africa. So I'm thinking that this good work, how can we ensure that it is going to have the impact that it have? So firstly, I was thinking, I do agree with Andrew on the numbers, because politicians are going, we need to sort of raise an alarm to say, we need to act. The situation is not okay.
Oh, I can't hear you. Pamela, could you speak up a bit more?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, I'm sorry, I think the mic was a bit far. Okay, so I'm saying we should use the iFEED process to raise an alarm, because these things are real. And if our politicians and stakeholders do not take action, we may indeed find ourselves in 2050 facing those kind of situations when this type of work was there that could have saved the day. So some of the things that I think should be done is, yes, we are looking at specific countries, but I was also thinking that would it be possible to have like first a regional policy brief that is covering realities for all the countries, because some of them are cross-cutting. And in that regional policy brief, we can also illustrate what has worked elsewhere. For example, in South Africa is way advanced in terms of its agri-food system. I'm thinking about South Africa and Malawi. For both of them, maize is the main crop, but the realities are different. South Africa is producing the size of land. I think South Africa is producing maybe 5 times as much as Malawi is producing. So what are the things that South Africa is doing right that Malawi can learn from, that can help Malawi to address an impending food crisis that is expected by 2050 if something drastic does not happen? Then based on that regional policy brief, then we can think of contextualizing the policy briefs per country. And then the most key thing, because our target are the politicians, we are technical people here, we understand the language that we are using. But I think when we get to the point of the policy brief, or maybe we can even go beyond the policy brief to develop talking points, we need to get communication experts that can unpack these things into a language that a politician can understand, because the way we are presenting here, we are able to understand, but a politician would just find it complex. So we need to break it down. I think go beyond the policy brief and come with talking points that we can all use as we advocate to our policymakers to make changes or to take actions based on the iFEED work, even after the project has completed. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. And sorry, we missed you talking there a bit, but you repeated and we caught up, so that was really good. Thank you. I think just to highlight the things that I mentioned at the end of the talk, which were about those kind of policy topic areas, which I think are definitely what you're thinking about in terms of that kind of regional policy. And I think it's a really nice idea and something for us to think about in terms of learning lessons and what different countries might learn from each other, which might work really well in there. So I'll give that some thought. And again, yes, absolutely. You know, we're all sort of trained to write in particular ways and for particular audiences, and how we might communicate best with a policy audience in Malawi or Zambia or so on. We definitely need to think about how we do that and how we do that effectively. One of the things that we've been looking at here is sort of infographics, so a lot less information but presented in a kind of visual way. So we could talk about whether that might be a good way to kind of translate some of this into those kind of talking points. But yeah, definitely there's something for us to kind of think about in terms of how we might translate these more into materials that are accessible to the audience that we want to communicate with. I don't know whether Stuart or Helen wanted to come in at any point.
Yeah, thanks, Guy. I guess just to follow up on that final point about language, because I think it's very important. If there are any kind of guidelines or examples that can be shared with us, that would be much appreciated. Or if there's an opportunity to work more directly with some of you to actually develop that language and those talking points, that would be equally appreciated. Thank you.
Okay, hello, thank you. I'm Sue Walker and I'm representing South Africa today. Yeah, as ours only came at lunchtime today, I haven't had a chance to look at it. So my comments maybe will be a bit generic, but I do agree with the past two people from Malawi. One of the points I would like to pick up is about, I understand that it's at a country level, but there's so many different agroclimates or agroecological zones across the country. So even if we just take the maize production area in South Africa, then from other things that I've seen, there would be a shift by 2050. So we've just got to be a little bit careful that we give this overall general thing that doesn't mean anything to anybody. But then that depends on who is going to be involved. And so I'm not really sure tomorrow about who's going to be there. But Pamela was saying that it's very difficult for the politicians or the policy guys to understand. I think I was even coming up for air and not understanding half of what was said today. So really, I think your slides for tomorrow have to be very clear, and the blocks have to be very clear and numbered very clearly. One of the diagrams had 2 number 1s. And so even me, I'm in here, but I don't know which one's number 4 and which one's wrong or right. And then it must be very clearly stated for this scenario, we saying this, not jumping around every time, because otherwise it's just impossible to follow what's going on. My idea might be that if you've got your 4 blocks and you've got different colors, then when you present the next slide, you could have that color scheme, because people identify with colors quite quickly and could understand that maybe in some way. Just one of the comments about maize, that in South Africa, the maize will stay almost the same under all the scenarios. There's some concern about that on the ground, because under the land redistribution, there's some question about whether the maize production will stay the same. Although we know that much of the land that has been redistributed is really under good high production of maize in some areas, especially I know around here in the northern part of Gauteng and that part. But what other crops were done in iFEED? So if no other crops are done, then how can we say anything about any other crops? Or are we just speculating then? So I share some of Malawi's concerns about too much speculation and no probabilities that people can, especially if there's any media people at the meeting tomorrow, we can really run away with some false messages in our Farmers Weekly or in our newspapers. But I will try to take a look tonight, although I have a number of other things to complete, and see whether I can give some feedback on the details. Thank you.
Stuart or Helen, did you have any thoughts you want to come back on?
Yeah, I can talk quickly again about the maize projections, and yeah, just to say about other crops we've modelled. We also modelled specifically potato, groundnut and soybean. And in place of other crops, we also used average projections from those 4 model crops. So we are assuming, in the absence of sort of more specific knowledge, if you like, on those other crops, that the projections will be the same as those crops. But specifically, we've obviously had to assume a number of things to get at the 2050 food production estimates and yield changes. And there's obviously a couple of things going on here. So one of them is the impacts of climate change. And as you were saying, Sue, there's serious doubts about what the impacts of climate change might be. And of course, we know that climate change is going to have some substantial negative impacts, say, on maize and other crop yields by 2050, unless we adapt to climate change. And therefore, we've looked at a range of options for adaptation. And for some of the scenarios that we've been presenting on today, we've assumed that there are fairly optimistic adaptation options in place, and therefore we can mitigate against those impacts. And in other scenarios, we've not assumed that, so we can get a sort of broader picture for what could happen in the future. And it's about kind of looking across those results and saying that, okay, we're fairly sure that given the impacts of climate change in South Africa, we need to increase irrigation in order to maintain crop yields, or we need to develop new crop varieties. I completely get what you're saying as well about communicating uncertainty, and I think we need to be very careful about the results we focus on, perhaps. As I was saying, we have got more detail in the documents themselves, but maybe we need to add in some of those confidence statements back into the documents. But as we've been saying, as Claire's been saying as well, they're still very much works in progress.
Yeah, as are the presentations. So as I said earlier, we're working towards tomorrow morning and not today. So what we've talked about today is very much a kind of where we got to by sort of 12 o'clock UK time today to kind of talk through those things. But I think it has made clear that simplifying is one thing, but at the same time, not simplistic, because we don't want to kind of misrepresent what we're talking about. So I think the emphasis very much has to be on the fact that these are the projected conditions under these scenarios. It's not a kind of prediction of what the future will look like, but actually under these different scenarios, this is what the projections look like, and we can have varying confidence in different aspects of what we say about those things. And I think we can make sure that those statements are made in that way. So that's some work for us this afternoon in terms of streamlining the presentations that we make tomorrow. But thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentations. I think most of them were quite clear. So from my side, first of all, let me say I like the way the summaries have been presented. Each country is unique in its own ways, so that makes it more better. For example, Malawi is looking at climate risk versus policy implementation. South Africa is looking at another thing. Zambia is looking at market connectivity and all that, which is literally good. However, I also agree with the rest of the team that there is a need to have some sort of a group thing. Why I'm saying this is because I also found out that there are certain common items or common key messages that actually came out from each of the scenarios. For example, an issue of crop diversification literally came out from all the countries. An issue of reliance on maize, of course, it's basically for Malawi and South Africa, but it's literally the same applying to crop diversification. Even including that, a key message on extreme weather conditions affecting crop production is also coming out on almost all the countries. So that actually shows and displays that there is that need of coming out with a group thing. My last comment basically is on the whole presentation. Despite that we have various key messages under each country, on top of that, it would also be great if we can have what are the topmost key messages, which would be like some sort of major takeaways. Because I'm sure that if we have got 9 or 10, somebody should be able to pick up the topmost 2 or 3. So I would also expect that we should have those top key messages under each scenario. Yeah, thank you.
Perfect, thank you. That's really helpful. So the second one about the top messages, we'll work on that. I think that's a useful thing that we can have for each of the countries to kind of say, these are, if you take nothing else away, then take these. And thank you for highlighting where you see the commonalities, because yes, that's definitely something that we will be working on, and I'll see what I can build into that kind of when I talk about the sort of cross-cutting policy topics at the end. So thank you.
My name is Winfred Mbungu. I'm from Tanzania. First, thank you for the presentations and illustrations that you provided. And I'll try to reiterate what my colleagues have said. That has been a lot of work, and maybe that's where my first thinking would be, where the modeling done separately for each country, or it's just a country model. And with that, it also goes into what needs to be taken as a scenario for each country. And I know there's a lot of diversity in that. So I would think, or try to just talk about the projections for Tanzania. And we have discussed this before, I know, and we were also thinking or asking the same, what Sue here asked, about what other crops were used, because we look into the staples for the country, because unless people change their eating habits for the next 30 years, then they'll continue consuming maize, bananas and others. And as Stuart said, these were considered in other factors of some production trends from literature. But this most prevalent here, it looks like maize, the one that is the most prevalent crop. And potatoes, though it is just for some areas in the country that grow potatoes and that. But I would I would try to also go back to the same idea that there's a lot of variability in the maize production. So we have the agroecological zones, and you look also into the semi-arid areas as well. They also have different characteristics, like we have unimodal and bimodal areas. They also have a lot of different traits that go along. But overall, I tend to agree with the fact that for the majority of the scenarios, it looks like the increase in productivity is mostly related to land expansion. And that is also a critical factor. Like they said, in Malawi, it will be 44 million in 2050. But in Tanzania, I think we are going to look at around 100 million. Because now we are around 60 plus, so we might be looking at 100 million people. Everyone expanding, so that in order to feed your population, you have to expand more. And that's why our concern was more, can we have a technology that makes us produce, like the intensification? Can we intensify in the little land that we have? We produce more to feed the population, and that is the main concern, because land expansion is going to result into so many other issues, like encroachment in marginal areas, or degradation of forests, and even the land that is also producing, and also conflicts that we have livestock keepers, but are going to encroach farming areas. And those are also environmental issues that are going to be a real problem into the future. And it's nice that in the policy topics that you have highlighted, the land is changed under these risks. And although we do not have a scenario with the market, but we understand the role of market as well in all these, how the trade, export and import affects all these scenarios as well. Is very critical, and we see that as going to be a critical factor, especially also in the nutrition aspect. So what we produce in the future, or what we intend to produce in the future, is this going to be nutritious enough to also provide the security in terms of what people consume, and what can be imported from other areas, and how does that affect the market or the trade activities. So just to wrap up, I would like highlighted before, the same idea of how we communicate to the audience. With this, there's a lot of information, maybe nothing we can throw away, but how do we take the message in a simplistic way to the policymakers? And I would really love if we had at least some graphics, maybe not for a policy, but graphics would work much better as well to tell people the severity of what the issue at hand that has to be taken into consideration. And if we, like the one that we showed today for Tanzania, if we take it to the policymakers, it is still a lot of information which they might not be able to absorb. But we need to really put it in a very simple and graphical way so that people can understand it. Thank you.
Thank you. Some really helpful comments there. And yeah, I think the population, I think, is a significant population increase is a significant issue across all of the countries as well. So I think that that's another kind of those cross-cutting issues that commonalities that I'll make a note of. Any thoughts, Stuart?
Yeah, just to say a little bit more about the issue of, say, land expansion. So Tanzania is an interesting example in this case, thinking about those demographic changes as well as yield projections. So what the results are showing across the different scenarios in Tanzania are that we almost certainly need intensification of crop production alongside potentially land expansion, because in the low technology scenarios in Tanzania, we're seeing substantial land expansion, but then we're not assuming, say, technological innovation in those scenarios. What we're seeing there is food security is almost certainly not going to be achieved without, say, in that case, substantial increases in imports. So that's an example to show that unless we do things like diversify and increase irrigation, develop new crop varieties, we're going to be really struggling to even produce enough calories in Tanzania to feed people, let alone thinking about sort of the broader nutritional picture. So I think land expansion is going to be probably potentially a key cross-cutting topic as well, I think, across all the countries.
Hello, this is Vivian Kazi from ESRF Tanzania. As my colleagues have already said, I appreciate the work that we have done as a team for the iFEED work, and it's really important to know how we are going to fare in 2050. I have some few observations and maybe one question. Yes, I heard from Marceline that from Tanzania, the best scenario is techno-fix, where there is high food production and where livestock will increase in terms of number, but also we expect also food security in that scenario. And I wanted just to add on the work that the team has done, Marceline, just to amplify on the issue of irrigation, because I know it will be take for the technology fix, for the techno fix and increasing the productivity, but also to amplify the issue of, the key assumptions that we've taken to opt for this scenario, and even for the rest of the scenarios, to write up what are the key assumptions that have been used, and also to provide some recommendations on the specific recommendations on policy change, policy interventions, because we have said that there's a need to intervene in terms of policy processes. So it's important to recommend which policy do we need some changes. Is it the current agriculture policy of 2013? There are some issues that you want us to accommodate so that it can be seen as a specific policy for Tanzania, so a specific policy for Malawi, for Zambia, for South Africa. But also, is there a policy gap? Maybe there is a policy that is not there, is not existing in Tanzania or Malawi or South Africa or Zambia, but it's important to take note if we are to take this, the scenario that we have proposed. So it's important also to highlight the policy gap so that even the policy makers, when we present these results, they'll be able to accommodate maybe in their next plan. And my other comment is on the translation of this brief. I think the issue is not now to go for translation of the current publication, because it is too technical, as Pamela said. We need another step before we do publication, maybe a step to find someone who is very much good to write a policy brief for specifically for different groups, because the current one is okay if we give to researchers and academicians for the technical people. But when we target the people like the members of parliament and some technocrats from the ministries, central ministries, regarding central ministries specifically focusing on issue of environment and agriculture, we need to find someone to suit to that case. So the matter is not to translate the current one, but the matter, I think, is to get it set for the specific audience before we go for translation. And when we do translation, we will focus on the specific context. For Tanzania, we'll opt for the Swahili. I'm not sure about Malawi and some other countries, but we need to set it for audience that is targeted first before we go for translation. And the other issue is on the context. I'm not sure if you, in the modeling exercise, did you consider the audience, the context, specifically for the practitioners or for the people who are engaged in the production? For instance, in Tanzania, majority of people who are engaged in the production is small farmers, against South Africa, where I see medium and large enterprises. So for instance, if you propose the scenario for Technofix, where we expect high productivity, where we expect increases in food production and livestock, and we also expect food security. Is it okay if we continue with the current practice of let it set for the smallholder farmers? Or do you recommend us to do agricultural transformation? Because depending on the level of technology, maybe it might be difficult for the smallholder farmers to adopt it, given the level of education. For Tanzania, we have just launched our agriculture, it's called the Agriculture Sensor, Dr. Mbuvu. Yes, it's the Agriculture Sensor, and it's publicly available through our National Bureau of Statistics website, NBS website. So you can really see who are the people practicing the agriculture in Tanzania. These are smallholder farmers, maybe 90%. So we are missing the middle and the large enterprises. So given the proposal that you are proposing now on the Technofix by 20, so that we can be good in terms of mitigating the risks of climate change, but also increasing food security. Can we still go for smallholder farmers, or we need to do transformation? And if that is the case, to go for transformation to engage some more people in the medium and large enterprises should be known from the brief that you have proposed, you have written, so that even the decision makers are the ones that we target to be able to change the policies or the current plans and strategies should take that into account and encourage medium and large enterprises to invest in the agriculture sector. And my last comment is on the vision, specifically for Tanzania. We have our national vision, is called the Tanzania Development Vision 2025. And our tech, or our key vision from the TDV 2025 is almost, now we are in 2021, we are remaining with 4 years to reach to 2025. We want to go into the middle income country. So given the vision, the country vision that we have in the proposal for the Technofix, I need also to see it in the document that maybe in the next 4 years, if we adopt it, maybe it will help us to reach somewhere near to our vision. Or if not, maybe if you'll be available also, I'm not sure about the next vision. By 2025, we'll have another vision of 25 years maybe. So it will be up to 2050. So I'm not sure if you'll also be available to do some more consultations when we go for the next vision to accommodate the issues of iFEED results. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vivian. And it's really useful. And unfortunately, Marcelin had to dash away for the second hour of this meeting. So I will definitely pass on some of your comments to him. But I'll also recommend that he has a conversation both with you and with the champion for Tanzania, because I think it will take a working together collaboratively to figure out those kind of explicit recommendations for changes to particular policies, or to highlight those policy gaps, because you guys will have that knowledge of what's the particular policies in Tanzania. So I think it will require a bit of a discussion between you. So I will let Marcelin know that, and hopefully he can have that conversation with you, because I think it's in those conversations and getting your expertise on board that will help us to incorporate those things. And yes, I think it's highlighted again the importance of having a shorter infographic that particularly at for each of the countries, whether or potentially for each of the scenario summaries. But I think we need to kind of really think about that and then how that gets translated, because then the kind of more detailed summaries can sit behind and be useful for technical people, but having a kind of a simplified one-page infographic might be the way to go. So I think something for us to think about in terms of how we might create those. But thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. My name is Gerard Tunzo. Also, I'm from Tanzania. I work with the Ministry of Agriculture. I would like to address one issue about the increase of the expansion of land so that we can have much production. For myself, I think it's a bad idea. Or we can use technology. I think we can use technology to raise production. In Tanzania, we have farmers who have already participated in agriculture activity, and we have seen that the issue of technology and the practice and technology that they are using, it's not much quite to their way of production. So I think there is a need to look on technology issue. We should see on how we can promote on that. My colleagues have already explained many things on other area, especially in how to advise those politicians in area of agriculture and other sector. So we need to have much effort on technology. The other things that I've already noticed here, iFEED should go beyond on what they are doing. We should consider that even we can do on ground. We have seen other countries represent on what they are doing, different finds. We need to go beyond that. We need to have even activity. Those can be addressed direct on the ground to implement in different areas, especially maybe in an area like technology and other things. That's my concerning. We need to go beyond that so that we can have much effort on raising those things. Thanks.
Thank you. Stuart, do you have any thoughts in relation to iFEED, technology versus land expansion?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. I mean, as in there's a clear trade-off, I think, and Helen and others have flagged that if we are assuming an increased agricultural land, there are going to be downsides to that in terms of ecosystem services and sustainability. Just to be perhaps clear about what exactly we've assumed in the modelling for land expansion, say in Tanzania and indeed the other countries where we have seen substantial land expansion in the scenarios, we've assumed that we're not going to expand into currently protected areas and not into forested areas. So we kind of used up other land. But we recognise that even that there are going to be issues around sustainability. So it's certainly a complex issue that we perhaps need to bottom out more in the key messages.
Good day, colleagues. Thanks, it's Norma from the NAMC. Thank you again for the presentations. I think the common reality amongst us is that population is really going to double by 2050. And research like this is really needed and it's going to be important. And again, let me just re-emphasize that I think it's going to be very important on how we package this information so that it can be relevant from bottom to up. Just another concern from my end is that these projections are for the year 2050, and there will be a lot of changes between now and then. So I was wondering if the research could come up with early warning signs that could possibly happen between now and then, so that each country could possibly draw some action plans to try and mitigate these scenarios. And also just another point I thought of as you were presenting is that in the key take-home messages, it would be nice to have some action plans along those so that each country can be clear on the recommendation that is coming out of the study. And lastly, I think when it comes to the issue of policy, I think in Africa or in South Africa, we are known generally for good policies that are written, but we lack in terms of policy implementation. So it would be nice if also when you talk about policy, you then talk about the implementation side to it. How then do we put on the table practical ways on implementing these recommendations so that we can avoid the worst case scenario? That's it from my end. Thank you so much, colleagues.
Thank you, Noma. That's great. And yeah, I think we are certainly in the scenarios summaries for Zambia. I was thinking about implementation, but I think we can look at that across the board. And I think it will be, yeah, again, it will be having conversations with you guys about what that kind of practical implementation will look like, because I think you will have some good ideas and will understand the context better to be able to kind of input into that. I don't know whether Stuart has any thoughts on the kind of early warning signs. I think in some ways we're kind of thinking about it in terms of, given that these are possible futures, what can we do now? Early warning signs be damned. I think the early warning signs are already there. So I think what we're thinking, certainly what I'm thinking is that these are possible futures, and what should we be doing policy design, policy implementation now in order to mitigate any of those possible futures? I don't know whether you had any thoughts, Stuart.
Yeah, I was just going to say exactly that, Claire, so I won't say any more. Thank you.
So I don't think there are any early warning signs except what's already happening now. So I think we can assume that the early warning signs are already there. I'm also aware that we're at 2 o'clock, our 2 hours that we had scheduled for this session.
Right, we have gone around everyone in the room very quickly. Frank and Nawiko in Zambia, I don't know if we can give you 2 minutes each, very, very quickly, if you have any quick interventions. Otherwise, from our side, I think all the colleagues in the room have shared their perspectives. Can I give our Zambia colleagues the opportunity to quickly come in and say something?
Thank you very much, Ian, and thanks very much for the great presentations made by our colleagues in the UK. I think for Zambia, basically the key issues that have been identified of diversification, commercialization, irrigation, and food security, those are quite very key. And we have had some discussions with our policymakers on these issues. I was just wondering, I think on the policy topics, would want to know maybe how each one of these key issues will look like under the climate risk scenario. I think it will be important so that when we talk to our policymakers, we know that these issues will be like ABC under these climate risk issues. I thank you.
Thank you, that's really helpful. And yes, I think when we start thinking about those kind of cross-cutting policy topics, I think definitely we've kind of caveated all of them with under climate risk. So I think we're thinking of them all in terms of what this means under low climate risk and what this means under high climate risk. So definitely that's something that we're already starting to think about.
Frank, anything to add?
Frank says, I think his mic is off, so he's unable to say something at this moment because of his mic. Thank you.
It's okay.
He's written in the text, and we've been responding to him on the texting. So I think we've got Frank. That's good.
Perfect. Then lastly, Nalishebo, anything to add?
Hi, everyone. I've obviously been listening into the various presentations from the project countries, and I'm really, really excited to see this work that is being undertaken, particularly that it's happening just after COP26. And you know that a lot of the countries following COP26 will begin to look at how to implement some of those commitments that they've made in their NDCs, NAPs, etc. And I see this work actually sitting to support how those countries will be looking at operationalizing their NDCs and NAPs. You know that I know a lot of these countries have actually developed those documents, but I don't think that they're even familiar or even know how they are going to go about rolling out what is contained in those documents. Very recently, and for your information, the African Union Commission has launched a new program, and it's called the Comprehensive Africa Climate Change Initiative. And part of that concept is to actually support countries to begin to think about how they will roll out their NDCs and NAPs. Something for you to look at. I'm sure you're also familiar with the Green Recovery Action Plan that the African Union again launched at during COP26. So these are important initiatives that you should familiarize yourselves with, because the work that is being done under iFEED will be very useful going forward. So really excited about the work that you're doing, and I'm also happy that, I'm happy to promote the work that you are doing in whatever platforms I find myself. So thanks for the opportunity, and hope to see you tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Nalishebo. Tomorrow is your meeting. You are hosting us tomorrow. So we are looking forward to that meeting. Thank you very much, our colleagues, those who are in the room, those who are online from University of Leeds, from Zambia, from Chatham House. Thank you so very much for joining us. Even the Fanapan Secretariat, thank you for joining us. Let me give over to Tembi to give us our closing remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to the THEMC team for all the hard work and for summarizing and presenting what I'm sure is quite a mountain of work in so few minutes. And thank you to the colleagues in the room for the reflections. I think the whole point of this discussion is so that tomorrow we don't get into that meeting where we have other people and start surprising each other with questions, yet we're supposed to be working together. So I think it has worked very well to have this session. I think we bring the meeting to a close now, and we excuse our colleagues online. Thank you very much. Here we're going to start doing COVID protocol things. So you are excused, and we'll see each other tomorrow morning. Yeah.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
That went very well. Thanks for the brilliant suggestions. And this is partly what this session was going to be about, but also certainly tomorrow's session as well from the wider stakeholders. If they have any quick feedback, like the guys were saying, they want now to work on finalizing those outputs. As of now, they're still in draft form, but this feedback that you have been giving that we are hoping to get tomorrow, it's all going to add up to helping them to finalize those outputs before they are then widely disseminated. And also the wonderful suggestions in terms of the policy briefs that we'll need and possibly even transparency and all of those issues. So I think this has been a very good meeting. We managed to get what we needed out of it.